I want to ask you first why you came, not why you came here today, although you may be asking yourself that not long from now, but why you came to Austin, why you were the right person for the job, and what it was about your past higher ed experience that made you think you were prepared for this job.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me. This is the second time I've been at a Tribune event. The first time there were fewer people at TribFest, and now I know why. This is free. That was not free.
Correct.
That was kind of a humiliating experience because I spoke in one of the theaters to a pretty small crowd, went outside, and there was a line completely around the block waiting to see Stormy Daniels' lawyer speak right after me. So anyway, that was my introduction to the Tribune.
Note to self, block Rhonda Safferty's phone number after this event, because I know that she did that to me here just now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I spent 30 years in public higher education.
Correct. And you'd been a Wall Street guy once upon a time.
I've been a Wall Street lawyer before that, and I probably can't explain fully why I left Wall Street and went to education, but I can explain why I stayed in it, and that is because of the incredible impact that one gets to have. This is going to sound sentimental, but the impact that one gets to have, if you believe as I do, and I know you do, and probably everybody in this room does, that talent is universal, doesn't have anything to do with race, religion, gender, zip code, anything else, but opportunity is not. And the great difference maker in this country is public higher education. It's education in general, but public higher education produces 70% of the degrees in this country. And it is the engine of social and economic mobility, the likes of which the world has never seen. So that's why I do this. Why Texas? I spent, as you went through, a trip around the country at 3 other university systems.
All very different, by the way. North Carolina, very different from Nebraska. Nebraska, very different from CUNY.
Very different. If we get into politics at some point, it's fascinating. I know you're going to do a story on regents at some point. And how they are selected around the country is a fascinating subject, because each of those 4 has a different method of selection. But Texas has its ethos here. Everybody around the country knows there's something different about Texas. Now, depending on where you live, that may be positive or negative. To me, it's enormously positive.
Right. So what starts here changes the world, or what starts here deranges the world, right? That's
what some people might refer to as swagger. But I prefer to say that it is a sense of confidence, a sense of ambition, and a sense of optimism that I don't see in other places in the country. I don't see the same level of a sense of self and a sense of optimism about the future, that if we do the right things, we make the right choices, we make the right investments, this place is going to be successful.
And so there's an opportunity for somebody who cares about public higher education, as you say, to come to a place with high ambitions, big, hairy goals, and do big things.
Add to that, it's the 2nd largest state in terms of population and the 3rd youngest. So if you want to have an impact, it's a lot easier to increase educational attainment levels. You start with young people.
This place is also the future in terms of demographics. Texas is modeling for the rest of the country what they're going to look like in 20 to 30 to 40 years. And so if you get it right here, you have an effect on the rest of the country.
Absolutely right. If we don't do a better job in access and success across all demographics in the population, we are not going to have the educational attainment level of the state that we need.
Right.
A, to give people opportunity, and B, to be competitive.
So you came with an idea of what Texas would be and the opportunity. Did you come with a specific punch list of goals, or was it more existential?
So a punch list of goals seems a little presumptuous to come into Texas as a first-time resident.
But Mr. Milliken, you had a job interview. Presumably, they said to you, "If you get this job, what do you want to do?" You gave them an answer, didn't you?
Right. I told them.
So tell me
the values that I have. Yeah. The ideas that I have for the future of Texas. So, just to it's still at 10,000 feet though.
Yeah.
This place may grow. It may double in population over the next 30 years.
Well, in fact, the demographers are predicting exactly that it'll go to 54 million by 2050.
Right. So the question is not, do we have the level and the enough higher education today to serve Texas? It's, do we have enough higher education, and is it doing the right things to educate the future of Texas, because we can't start in 28 years to get ready for 30 years of double the population.
Right.
So we need to do a number of things better and differently and more of them to be able to serve this changing
And it's not
Texas.
only one thing, but it's multiple things. It's
Yeah,
access
absolutely right.
and affordability and excellence and
Success.
and success.
Success. I mean, probably the most important agenda item in this country in public
Right.
higher education right now is the completion agenda.
Correct. And which I want to come to in a little bit. But first, I want to ask you about the last couple of months of work, which has really been consumed, as I see it, by the changes happening at the UT system. I want to start actually narrow with the UT system and then broaden out more to the higher ed agenda now and going forward. You got here in September-ish. Mm-hmm. And by about the middle of October, what is referred to casually as the LTIF report, but is formally the System Administration Task Force Organizational Assessment, came out. You have been consumed really for the last few months with this report, the byproducts of this report, the implementation of this report, the implications of this report. Has the fact that you've had to spend time on that in your first few weeks and months here undermined your ability to start off on the right foot in terms of the big, hairy goals that you may have, either 10,000-foot view or on the ground?
No, I think it's advanced that opportunity.
It's advanced it.
Yeah. Let me say that, first of all, I don't know that I've been completely consumed during the last 4 months with this, but it has been an important agenda item. But in addition to that, I've been to 14 universities across the state and spent a good deal of time on...
I have no doubt that you spent your time on the campuses, meeting people, and peace. But at the same time, you show up on day one, and on day whatever, 30, 40, the conversation all of a sudden turns to cuts to the system, cuts to the head count. We're going to change the way that we think about the system. Now we're going to be a service provider. It's going to be bottom up instead of top down. I mean, I'll go through what some of the things were in the report. I have to believe that if you're the boss, you come in, and within literally a month, all of a sudden this thing lands with a thud.
Yeah.
It has to consume you to some degree.
Right. So I'd like to think that coming to this, my fourth higher education system, I knew how to do a little bit of due diligence about it. So it was not a shock to me that there was going to be a report coming.
You knew
this was
coming.
It was not a shock to me about the nature of the discussion that had been here. You know, I reported to the board in November, shortly after I arrived, about what one thinks about when one comes to a new university system as its leader. And one of the things that you spend your first year doing necessarily is assessing the operation, making sure we have an obligation to be as cost-effective as possible, to deliver efficiently a high-quality product to the people of the state of Texas. And whether there had been a task force or not, I would have been engaged in making my own judgments about that based on 30 years of experience. As I said then, the task force report was a benefit to me. It gave me an assessment based on, first of all, 4 thoughtful members of the Board of Regents. Second, interviews with every president of our institutions. Third, interviews with a deep bench of people in the system administration to get their views also. So starting on day one with this was perhaps an advantage that one doesn't typically have when one comes.
You would have had to take a year or more doing this assessment, this audit yourself. Instead, you come and they've done it for you.
Exactly right.
Right. And so they hand this off to you.
Exactly right.
So the parameters of this were, it had been in the works for a little bit more than a year, right? The study that was done. The system had begun, I had to go back and remember this, but the system had begun to receive scrutiny from lawmakers about growth and spending. There was a conversation in the last session about that, and it was a range of issues. There was the construction of the system building downtown, that came up at one point. There was the discussion of a Houston presence, the purchase of land and the expansion into Houston. Those things all fed into an exercise that took a little bit more than a year. And I mentioned the recommendations, the principal recommendations, there were others. The service provider model, that's the phrase actually called out in the report, service provider model. Better support for small campuses, which I think you're kind of for this, right? You think?
Absolutely.
Because the relationship between UT Austin as the flagship and the other campuses, whether this is real or perceived, has been fraught up in the air. You know, does UT Austin get too much love from the system? Do the regional campuses not get enough love? And the fact that access to UT Austin is a hot commodity. Often you have opportunities for kids who want to go to UT Austin to go to other campuses. And then this idea of no top-down initiatives from the system, but actually everything bubbling up. Those two ideas, the importance of the regionals and bottom-up as opposed to top-down, you're good with that. You like that idea.
I am good with it.
Yeah.
You want me to say more about this?
I want you to talk as much about it as you want.
So this is not a conversation that is exclusively held in Texas. This happens, there are 46 higher education systems in this country, and this happens everywhere. And it should happen at every level of administration. You know, most of the administrators in the UT system, and I'm not telling any secrets here, are not at the UT system administration. They're across 14 institutions, as they should be. Right. But so we need to, I think, periodically, often, review what we're doing, whether it makes sense to be doing it, and how we're doing it, how well and how effectively we're doing it. Right before I came to Texas, I spent over a year with a consulting firm in New York looking at the CUNY system. And I thought that we together developed a model that makes a lot of sense to me. What's the appropriate role for a system administration, any system administration? So there are certain things that must be done there. There are policies. You have a governing board that sets policies ultimately. There are compliance matters. There are financial control issues because you have a fiduciary obligation to the people of the state of Texas. There's a coordination. There are approval of degree programs, plans, assessment of the campuses. All that's got to be done there. Then there are things, the vast majority of the work that has to be done on the campus, that faces the students, the faculty, the large number of people that work for the university system. So HR primarily there. All of these things have to be done on the ground. Then there's a third area of things, true shared service. It's not just another word for systemize or centralize, but those areas where you need an expert function. Some IT functions, some others, some HR functions, where you can do it in one place. You don't need it in 14 or 15 places. And you have real governance of that. Now, that's how we run our system enterprise student affairs software for 7 of our campuses. It's done in Dallas. It has a governing board of people that are representative of each campus who make decisions, set priorities. That's a shared service. It's not central, it's not campus, but it's rational.
But largely, Chancellor, what you're talking about is back-of-house functions. These are not public-facing functions. You know, the criticism of the system in the past has been it does not educate a single student. It does not grant, except in the most technical sense, a single degree. It really plays more of an administrative role, more of a back-of-house role. It is the work of the campuses and of the individual institutions within the system that is public-facing, right?
Well,
and so the criticism has been
public-facing, and of course it doesn't teach any students or do any research, but you know, neither does the president's office or the dean's office. But I mean, most of the administrators are spread throughout a university system, and so
sure. But I'm simply giving voice to what had been prior to your arrival, the criticism of the system, that the spending at the system had gone up.
Well, I'm not going to defend the spending of the system before. I can only defend decisions that are made in the last 4 months.
I'm not asking you to defend it. I'm just simply observing that prior to your arrival, the conversation was about whether the system had gotten a little bit off the leash in terms of growth, and whether because the system does not educate a single student, whether that needed to be reined in. That was what precipitated, in theory, this report.
Look, the first part of this is quite a legitimate discussion, as I've said many times, including here. We have an obligation to be as cost-effective as we can. You know, the second piece of this, every company in America has SG&A that doesn't go into the manufacture of their product, and they're absolutely necessary. So the 46 systems in this country, creations of their state. And the reason they were created is not because somebody at the flagship said, hey, we'd like to join a system. Why don't we do that? They weren't created for the faculty or for the governance of individual institutions. They were created for the people of the state so that there was a place that is responsible to the people for oversight, for management, for coordination, to make sure that assets are used as effectively as possible, and producing an entire system of education that serves the state. And that's what the University of Texas system does.
So the second key aspect of this so-called L-type report was a reduction in headcount. And it called for, as I understand it, 110 positions to be reduced as the initial report came out. At this point, at least as of the reporting of my colleague Shannon Najmabadi of a few weeks ago, 65 positions had been eliminated, and there was a discussion of possibly more than the total of 110 called out being the reduction in headcount by the end. Can you confirm that?
I'm going to start where you started. The report called for the possible reduction upon further study of between 70 and 110 FTE.
So 110 was the worst case as called out by the report.
Well, a judgment, but that was the span. What it also said in certain areas that, for instance, facilities planning and construction, where we have people actually working, living at some of the smaller campuses in particular. There are 4 campuses that do their own facilities planning and construction, but there are 10 that don't. And we have actual people on the ground there managing construction projects. So, of course, the report said this would have to be done over time in certain areas to not disrupt the service function.
Yes.
So I did what I could, and I shouldn't say I did it with the help of the people who have been here for some time managing. We did it closely with the unit heads in every area that was affected.
Right.
But in certain areas, we said, we need to take a deeper dive here. And first of all, I don't want to disrupt the service that's going on today. Second of all, I want to have a conversation with the board and others about what the function is and why it's either necessary or could be better done someplace else.
Right. So, come back to the second part of my question. The premise was that you're not done in terms of headcount reduction.
Correct.
That is a true fact. You are not done. And you estimate that it is possible that the headcount will approach that upper end of what was recommended in the report, the range, and it may exceed it before this is all over.
Yes.
How has the implementation been received internally and elsewhere within the system? In other words, in the system headquarters and out among the 14 campuses. What's the response been? What's the morale within the system? What's the morale on those campuses as it relates to this retrenching?
I probably can't speak to the second part of this, the reaction around the system. I'm just not aware of that at the institutional level. I, of course, have had conversations with the presidents repeatedly about this.
Yeah.
And they are, of course, as you might imagine, depending on the size of the institution and how much of these functions it does completely on its own, they're less concerned about it. The smaller institutions that are more dependent on things like the legal services, the HR services, the construction services, they are more sensitive to it and more concerned about what the outcome will be, as you would expect.
Right.
Internally, it's what you would think. This has been a subject of public discussion for some time.
Has been.
And our folks are smart, and they read the paper, and they look at what's going on. They read the report of the task force. So they know what the reality is. The best we can do is through the team of people, the leadership at the system administration, work closely with people in every division, help them understand what we're doing. We're very clear about this, that this is not a performance review. This doesn't have to do with how well they did their job and how well they've done it for years. This has to do with the organization of this enterprise that exists to cost effectively serve the people of the state in a way that the Board of Regents, the governing body of the university, has determined.
And directed, right.
Yes.
You're building for the future. It's not as much about the past as it is about the future.
It's not to say that there won't be. There may be areas that, in fact, we have to invest more in at a system administration. If you look at what's happening around the country in terms of the cyber threats and the threats to assets and information security and that kind of thing, those may be functions where, along with a central audit and a compliance and a risk management function, the board is going to feel like they need that at the system administration to be able to fulfill their fiduciary obligations.
And some of the resources that you free up as a consequence of the changes you're making now may in fact be able to be or would want to be redirected to some of those things at some point.
They may be redirected to that, but of course they will also be redirected to the institutions.
Right. So can you estimate what the total cost savings to the system will be as a consequence of these changes over time?
I could, but it wouldn't have a great deal of validity at this point because I just don't know of the places that we are still.
There's no number you can.
There's no number. I'm going to. If you have me back later, I'll give you the number. But I've got 4 areas which constitute over 50% of our workforce that we're looking at.
Right. Let me ask the question another way. There has always been this low-level discussion about the way that the permanent university fund is allocated. 2/3 goes to the University of Texas, 1/3 goes to A&M. And as I understand it, and I'm a novice at this, you're an expert by now, I'm sure, The system actually, by way of the available university fund, makes the determination of how much of the allocation that comes to the University of Texas goes to the system and goes to the campus, correct?
Yeah.
And there have been times when it's been like 50-50. My question is, do you, at a moment of retrenchment where you're reducing headcount and where you're kind of narrowing the footprint of what the system is going to do you make a decision to recalibrate the percentage of that allocation that goes to the system and say, we need less because we're spending less, so we're going to actually put more onto the university campus?
Yeah, and in fact, in the last year, that's already been done once. It may be done again, but yes, it was done. It was changed. The percentage that went to UT Austin increased, and the percentage that came to the system decreased.
So that is, in fact, the mechanism for these changes to live in the world, is that you guys narrow your footprint, and as a consequence of that, one effect is that the University of Texas gets a higher percentage of the allocation.
Right. But we shouldn't get too excited about how much we'll move, because a number of the things that are done are fee services. So the construction program, we run the applications program for all medical and dental applications in the state of Texas. There are certain things where it's supported, self-generated budget. And so if we reduce those, we're not particularly going to save any money. We may save the institutions from paying for those fees, but they're going to have to support it at their campus. So we're going to be looking at what the best place to do this is, the most cost-effective, not just necessarily the savings here versus there.
Something that I thought was interesting that I did not know, although I try to pay attention to this stuff, that was called out in the report was that there has actually been a headcount reduction of some significance in the previous regime of the system. 228 positions, according to the report, had been cut at the system, or 25% under the previous chancellor. True.
I haven't studied the past reductions, but yes, I think I have no reason to think that's not true. I'm aware of some of them.
Was there a recalibration at that time? I mean, that's a pretty significant headcount cut. Was there a recalibration of the way that the funds from the PUF were allocated at that time as well, where more money was pushed off to University of Texas at Austin?
Yes.
That's the case, okay. Is there stuff that still needs to be corrected? I'm hearing in the air that there may be an L-type 2. In other words, the way to think about the first report is as the L-type report, but another way to think about it is L-type 1. Is there an L-type 2 coming?
Yeah, that's a good question, because first of all, the task force focused on about, in terms of the number of divisions within the administration, about half of them. About 15 or 16 of them, and that's how many they didn't. Now, you could argue that they focused on the ones that are the largest in terms of FTE, and that have gotten the most attention over time, and maybe that they had, over time, thought needed a particular look. So they may have, I believe they made that choice purposefully, rationally, of what they looked at. So what do you do with the rest? Well, it's a minority of the positions. It's under 40%, I think, of the positions total, starting before we did any reductions. And the conversation we're having now, it's not so much whether there's an L-type 2, as you say. We are engaged now in a conversation with the entire board about all of this. The L-type report sort of kicked off this discussion. And so, first of all, the reductions that we announced recently, I looked across the university system administration and did not limit it solely to the areas in the task force report. So there are areas that we've already addressed. So I'd like to think that we are taking advantage of the philosophy of that. Whether there's another task force will be a decision of the Board of Regents, or whether they would prefer that at this point the philosophy is clear, the process has been set in motion, the kind of conversation that we're going to have, we're in agreement on that, and maybe we move on.
Let's see how the implementation,
in the normal business of the university.
Well, let's see how the implementation of L-type 1 goes before we decide whether an L-type 2 is necessary or what the timing of that should be. And even if there is an L-type 2, it may make a totally different set of recommendations than the first report did. So we keep talking about the L-type report, the L-type report. Let's, for the benefit of the uninitiated, say that L-type refers to Kevin L-type, who is the new chair of the Board of Regents, former state senator from Tyler, appointed to the Board of Regents by Governor Abbott. There had been another chair of the Board of Regents, Sarah Martinez Tucker. What happened?
Well, there have been a lot of chairs of the Board of Regents.
Yeah, but not every chair of the Board of Regents or any other one that I can remember decided to resign with 2 years left on her term. You knew her before, did you not?
We had met before when she was Undersecretary of Education.
So to say you had a prior relationship is true but not accurate, as we like to say in the media.
It's a bit overstated.
I
knew Margaret Spellings when she was secretary. I knew Sarah when she was undersecretary.
Thanks to social media, we all know each other. I mean, that's how that goes, right? You don't know them. I understand. So there was no prior relationship where it's like she was responsible for you coming.
Well, she chaired the board of regents and chaired the search committee.
But it was sort of not.
But I don't think it was an inside job.
It was like, hey, pal, come on.
Yeah,
you know, right. Water's fine.
May have worked against me.
But I mean, I guess so she. It is said, it has been reported, stated as fact, I guess, that she left her position as chair because she did not support the findings of LTIFE 1, nor what the consequences would be of implementing the recommendations. True or false?
You said stated as fact. This is the first time
I've
heard that.
It has been. Well,
she appointed the task force. She clearly knew she appointed and charged the task force, so knew what they were doing.
So the report comes out. She says to the governor, "I'm quitting the board of regents." I mean, is there a possible reason I'm not aware of why she might have quit at that exact moment? I mean, doesn't it seem to you like there's a cause-effect there? Everything we've understood is that there was a cause-effect.
There probably is, but I don't have that information. You should have Sarah on and talk about this. I can't tell you what her thought process was. I can tell you that this is a person.
As a matter of fact, I happen to have her right here. Let me bring her out. Suddenly, this has turned into Annie Hall. Let me bring her out right now. Yeah.
This is a person who, is engaged in leadership positions around the country. Is on the executive committee of the Notre Dame board. I mean, she is a highly sought after leader.
Right, yeah.
And she had 4 very successful years at the UT system. Army Futures, TMC3, new presidents, overseeing the transition to a new chancellor. This is a pretty good body of work for somebody during their role as chair. So I can't speak to why she made her decision.
Yeah.
But she
I
did.
guess just sort of given the assumptions made, educated assumptions, at least educated assumptions about what happened there, I guess I want to go back to this question of, did you know what you were getting into when you came here? Did you think you were going to have autonomy? There is a sort of a hum in the air that you come in, all of a sudden you got to execute this report, lay people off, or make headcount decisions, said in a kinder way, retrench. And are you basically coming in to implement somebody else's vision for this system, the governor's vision, or even Senator Eltief's vision? Do you feel like you have adequate autonomy? Did you know when you came in what this would be like?
So, yes and no, I knew what it was when I came in. I would say, I used to say in New York that this isn't my first rodeo, but in Texas, I'm afraid I might get challenged if I said that. So
no, that sounds pretty good to me, actually. That's good. That's good.
But there is much that is common to these political organizations around the country. So did I know 100% what I was getting? Of course not. But did I know there'd be surprises? There'd be political decisions. There would be influence of donors, of students, of faculty, of politicians. Of course I did.
Right.
So am I surprised by all this?
You worked for Andrew Cuomo. I mean, you know what it's like to work with a governor who has a point of view.
So So autonomy, nowhere in higher education is autonomy the right word, I think. Whether you're talking about institutions, whether you're talking about chancellors.
Everybody works for somebody.
Everybody works for somebody. I feel like I have a great relationship with a new chairman of the board. I had a great relationship with the former chairman of the board. I have a great relationship with the new chairman of the board who at this point, for someone coming into Texas with a lot of experience in public higher education, but not much experience in Texas, having somebody who knows and is known well at the Capitol and is well respected is a terrific advantage for me. It's a great benefit.
But it's interesting because he and Regent Longoria were the two big critics of the system from within. And all of a sudden now he's running a place. He's a little bit like the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of the system, right? He was on
the outside. Running the place now?
He was on the outside of the system, and now all of a sudden he's on the inside. I mean, it's interesting. You know, the critic has now been brought in, is now part of the administration. I mean, I just think it's an interesting dynamic, and I'm just wondering about that. And I'm further wondering about your relationship with the governor. In other words, has the governor been clear with you about his vision for the system and his vision for higher ed? And are you good with that?
The governor and I have had a number of discussions from when I first came to Texas. And I must say I was impressed by his interest, his knowledge about the system, his commitment to higher education. We spent the first meeting we had together about an hour with him asking me questions about higher education nationally and how do you do this, how do you do that.
Right.
I'm not saying he didn't already know the answers, but it was...
Or didn't have a point of view.
But,
right.
well, yeah, I think he has a point of view, certainly. Most governors have a point of view about most of the operations of public operations of the state.
Right.
So, yes, I have a pretty clear idea that he was very supportive of the institutions of the UT system. Very clear emphasis on our emerging research, our 4 emerging research universities, and how important that was for all of Texas. I couldn't agree more. As I said before, the question isn't whether we have enough today, it's whether we'll have enough in the future. And the state of Texas, with 2 premier public research institutions, is inadequately prepared for the future. It needs more robust first-class research universities, and the emerging research
so you and the governor
those.
are aligned in that respect, and you feel comfortable as you don't work for him, but you work for him, right? You feel good with that relationship and his vision.
Absolutely. I would ask my colleagues in 49 other states if their conversations with the governor of their state are about the future and the investment in public higher education.
Were they with Governor Cuomo?
A different kind of conversation.
Did you just talk about the MTA? Maybe you have a better sense of why it doesn't work. So I'm
sure this audience is really interested in how much fare cards are today.
We have a live stream. There are people in New York watching. You now, as a consequence of Regent Tucker departing, and Chern have 4 new regents to be appointed, which is close to half the regents.
That's also more scintillating to you than it is to me. Now, at Nebraska...
Fact check true. I agree.
All right, stop.
I agree.
All right, stop. At Nebraska, there were 8 regions publicly elected in a popular election, and the cycle for doing this was 2, 2, and 4. So
should we elect our regents here?
Look, a long time ago, I used to be a secretary to the Board of Regents, like almost 30 years ago. And I'd go to these meetings nationally of people who did this. And there was only one thing that everybody agreed on, and that was that the method of selection of our board is not the right one.
Whatever the method is, it's the wrong one. It's the wrong one always.
And so I started at a place where they're popularly elected. Then I went to a state where they are elected 16 by the House and 16 by the Senate. Governor has nothing to do with it. Then I went to a place that is 10 appointed by the governor and 5 appointed by the mayor. And
not good.
We know how that works.
Right,
yes. Yeah. And so this is more typical in Texas, to have a governor appoint them and have them be confirmed by the Senate. But the fact that there are 4 coming in, great.
Well, it's a lot of change.
It is a lot of change. But look, these are going to be talented people. I have no question about that. And they're going to be people who care about the University of Texas system. These are not going to be people who have an agenda that is contrary to the university, the best interest of the Texas system.
You have a sense of timing?
Well, I only know what everybody knows about the time that the governor makes them in
soon-ish.
February. Yeah. 1 could be made immediately. 3 could be made later.
You have a list of names you want to tell us who the people are going to be?
That probably wouldn't help their chances. But,
I thought I would trick you into giving me the list, actually, now. Have you talked to the previous chancellors, McRaven and Figueroa, about the political aspects of this job? Have you gotten guidance or advice from them? They've both been through wars of their own previously. What'd they tell you?
McRaven, Figueroa, Udolph, Cunningham,
You talk to all these guys?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I do talk to them. I talked to them before I got here, and I talked to them after I got here.
What's the best advice you got? Don't identify the source if you want, or do if you want. What's the best piece of advice you got from them?
Buy more orange clothing.
Yes. Yes, that's true.
They had a pretty good idea. I was a little short on that.
It's not always flattering, but I think that's a good idea for the job, probably. Did they tell you how to deal with the legislature specifically? I mean, because you came in at an interesting moment, because you came in essentially right on the lip of a session, and that is a really interesting moment. It's like being put in a lineup on the first day in the majors, batting first.
Right. So no, dealing with the legislature, or however you phrase it, is not one of the subjects that we've covered in depth. So, as I say many times, I've done this for 30 years. I have always had a role working with the legislature. And as I said to the board and probably publicly, if you don't like politics, if it isn't part of what you want to spend your time with every day and dealing with elected officials and working on the intersection of education policy and politics, you should find another line of work. Because being the chancellor of a public university system involves that as a necessary part of your job.
And in fact, you have a chair who is now extraordinarily well familiar with the legislature and wired. You have a new head of government relations at the system who has a lot of experience with working in the legislature. And so you have good people to the left and the right of you who can march up the street with you.
Hiring good people, having good people, and I didn't hire Kevin, but having good people to the right and left of you is probably the most important thing you can do to be successful.
Right. So you have new, as of this last couple of weeks, you have new chairs of the House Higher Ed and Senate Higher Ed committees, people who had not had that job before. You are, relatively speaking, the veteran compared to those guys, right? Neither one had chaired the committee before. What does having new chairs of those two relevant committees of the legislature do to this session as it relates to your working with the legislature?
So first I have to use this because I read the other day about being a veteran. Given the number of people that move into Austin and the Austin area every day, I have now been here longer than 42,000 people in Austin. Right. So I am a veteran.
And every one of them is on South Congress between, between the bridge and Old Torf right now, actually, that's right. So what about that? You've got new chairs of House and Senate. It is kind of like a overturning of the mulch, is it not?
That's a lovely metaphor. Every conversation I've had in the Capitol, in members' districts, has been quite positive about the future of the University of Texas system, about what it does for the state. They may be more interested in one institution or another, but I've been, my thinking about this place, and it came both from the board as I was talking to them, from the governor, and from others, about this sense of ambition, which I think is in Texans' genes, and this optimism it comes through again and again and again. And so I don't think you could pick a better place to be doing what I do today.
Right. New chairs, old chairs, doesn't matter. The conversation is going to be that conversation.
I think so.
About the future of higher ed. So we talk about a lot of things at our legislature when it comes to higher ed policy. We talk about facilities. We talk about the state's share of higher ed funding, which has gone down over time, like the conversation around public ed funding, that the state's share has gone down over time. Push the costs off onto families and students, so there's an affordability conversation. You mentioned college completion earlier. That is a persistent conversation. There is the 60 by 30 report, which is itself a version of the college completion. Order for me where you think the conversation is going to be in terms of priorities. What are the big issues that jump out at you as you go up the street this session?
Well, those are all number one.
Every one of them is equal. Right.
So, look, you mentioned the affordability question. In this country, the high water mark for state funding share of universities' budgets was 1986, and it has gone down as a share of universities' budgets since that time.
Right, yeah.
In about, I think, 2008, maybe about 10 years ago, the lines crossed at the UT system in terms of support from state appropriations and support from tuition.
Yes.
So, and they're heading in the wrong direction. Tuition is necessary, of course. It's necessary every place.
Yep.
I'm delighted with what we've done, and I'm sure you'll ask me about this at some point, about private fundraising and the role of private support of the university.
Oh, indeed.
Because these things need to grow to try to help ease the burden both on the taxpayers of the state and the students, and to focus on excellence and quality at our institutions. So we need to, number one priority, fully fund our formula for our institutions. So you need a stable base of support at a university system. We are making choices that last people's lifetimes in hiring faculty, in building new science labs, in starting new academic programs. So we need to know that funding is there and it's stable over a period of time. So that's the most important thing. We've got new capital needs. We're growing. We're graduating many more students than we used to.
And you have facilities needs, not on every campus equally, but some campuses have taken a long It's been a long time since they had the upgrades that others have had.
It's been a long time, and they are growing at disproportionate rates, as you would expect.
Right.
And so that needs to be, capacity needs to be addressed.
On this question of tuition, as you say, there's been this crossing of the lines. 2003, the state voted to deregulate tuition. There is this misperception that somehow tuition has gone up at this precipitous rate since deregulation, when the reality is the rate of growth is actually slower since deregulation than before. But nonetheless, there is a perception, I think it's legitimate in the minds of many people in the state, that it's got a little bit out of hand and that the affordability question is beginning to be a real conversation. I crowdsource questions sometimes for interviews like this one, and so I crowdsourced a question from our mutual friend, Kurt Anderson. Kurt Anderson, who
he's
is...
a crowd?
He is a source, let's say that. He is the host of the Studio 360 podcast. He is the co-creator and co-editor of Spy Magazine and is a fellow Nebraskan like you and a mutual friend of ours. We discovered our mutual friendship when you arrived in Texas. So I asked him, what's a question you'd ask Milliken this morning? And he actually had a question on this affordability issue. He said, ask him how big a problem it is for America that college costs 3 times what it did in real terms when we went to college. So there's the problem of tuition and all that going up, but there's also it's sort of price versus cost versus value. It's a hell of a lot more expensive to go to school today than it was when we went to school.
It is.
What do you, and how is that good for America? What do you do about it?
And it's more essential.
Yeah. What do you do?
I mean, this is the great paradox today. I think in American society as it relates to higher education. Never been more important. $1 million earning potential over a lifetime. Difference between a high school degree. All new jobs at some point in the very near future are going to require education beyond high school. So it's more essential than it's ever been. And I think, frankly, everyone agrees with that.
Yeah.
And if anyone doesn't, then I want to know what their kids are doing. Because I think it's okay to disagree ideologically, but the test is, if you want your children to go to the best college they can, that speaks louder than words. But at the same time, what debt is $1.5 trillion now, maybe? Tuition has gone up too rapidly. Now, a lot of this happens at places that are sort of attractive poster children for tuition hikes. So if we can look at some Ivies that have gone to $70,000 a year and use that as a headline. You know, a number of years ago, the American Council on Education did a research project framed around a campaign called College is Possible to try to determine what were the impediments to going to college. And they found a couple of things that were really interesting. One is that most people dramatically overestimated the cost of college. And these are particularly in families without experience in college and first-generation students. And they dramatically underestimated the amount of aid available, both institutional aid, state aid, and federal aid.
Well, those are both bits of good, that's good news in both cases.
Yes.
Right, yeah, right.
So their campaign then that emerged from that was communicating with people what the real costs are and what aid is available so everyone has a chance to go to college. So the best thing that a state can do, and I happen to think one of the best investments a state can make, is in public higher education, because that keeps the cost of tuition down, and it's an investment that pays its return many, many times over.
You understand that every budget is a choice and not a referendum. There's a finite amount of money in the Texas budget, like there's a finite amount of money in all budgets. And you spend $1 on one thing, you are by definition not spending it on something else. Could you argue that spending money on higher ed at the state level is more important than spending it on public ed or spending it on health care? Would you take dollars away from those priorities to spend it on higher ed? Because the only way you're going to get more money on higher ed, especially this session, is if they spend less on something else.
So I think that, first of all, I would never want to be pitted against public education. This is
although you know you are.
So you say. This is what we are engaged in now, no matter how it's organized and what the names are and what the historical time periods are, we are engaged now in what I think most people recognize as a necessary period of lifelong learning and education.
Yep.
And increasingly begins with early childhood because of the development of the brain at that point. I would argue, and Jim Heckman won a Nobel Prize for this at the University of Chicago, this is an admission against interest. The best investment you can make in education is probably in the first several years of life, because that's when the brain develops, the cognitive skills develop the most, vocabulary, et cetera. And if you start behind early in K-12, very difficult to catch up. So this is as we would say in Nebraska, the seed corn for the university.
Right.
Is the,
well, you know, they've redefined,
K-12.
the bucket has been redefined really as pre-K through 16 and beyond, so that in some
Well,
ways
in
you're
fact,
both in the same.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
So we have a 100-year-old agrarian model of education in this country where the non-discretionary or mandatory or constitutionally required budgetary funding for K-12, but higher education in most states is among the largest discretionary items in the budget. And when budgets get tough, it's often the place that is hit first. Well, I'd argue that at least the first couple of years of that are as much a requirement today and as much an obligation of the state today as a high school degree was in 1930.
Yeah. Two questions before we go to the audience. Are you going to advocate on behalf of the system when you go up to the legislature this session that tuition rates should be higher? Do you believe you need more money from families and students because the state is not doing an adequate job?
Well, as you said, tuition deregulated, devolved to the governing boards, and ultimately that will be their decision. I think it's important, and I've thought this wherever I've been, to have frank conversations with political leadership about the implications of budget decisions. So as you say, it's a choice, absolutely. But part of making that choice is to be fully informed about the consequences. So I think it's incumbent upon me and my colleagues to be perfectly honest about what happens if the state funds us at this level or at that level, and what choices we have to make, certainly with their guidance and input, to meet the obligations that I think Texans share about the quality and the capacity and the growth of public higher education.
But saying that you're going to have a frank conversation, and I stipulate that you are sincere about that, does not answer my question. Are you going to advocate for a tuition increase or not?
It's too early to say.
Okay.
It's too early to say. Budgets have consequences, and what the state does
when
with
you
its budget
see
will have,
when you see what your allocation is, you can then make a determination.
Yeah, we're not going to.
Right.
I would never say we're going to raise tuition in the abstract. We only do it.
But you hold that as a possibility if the budget allocation is not sufficient.
Look, in all of public higher education, it has to be a possibility. You know, in California, in North Carolina, in New York, tuition was free for many years at these places. In fact, it's embedded in the Constitution in North Carolina.
Should it be
California.
free here? You want to go all Bernie Sanders on us?
I don't think that's possible. Yeah. I don't think it's possible. And frankly, while I think there is a huge public benefit, I mean, look, the competitiveness and wealth of a state and its people, the tax revenues, every social indicator is highly positively correlated with increases in educational attainment, and almost every negative social indicator with low educational attainment. So it can't be argued that there isn't a public benefit to higher education. And so I believe it is the obligation of the state, and they ought to be making a robust investment in that because of the good it does. But there is also a personal benefit.
Right.
There's an increase in income earning capacity. So it's a combination of things. It has to be, it's a shared responsibility.
But free is not realistic.
No.
Yeah. How's your relationship with the other chancellors? You know, you guys are kind of this sort of Ocean's 11 kind of crew marching up
Terrific. So
the street
here's what I discovered. I was reading a book.
The safe up here.
Right? I was reading a book the other day about higher education in Texas, and nobody had told me this. This is something they should have told me when I came in. That the Constitution of 1876 says that the Texas Mechanical and Agricultural College is a division of the University of Texas, and that has never been changed. So I'm going to call John Sharp in for his performance evaluation soon.
Oh my God.
So
is this what passes for smack talk against Sharp?
Oh, look, I'm not that good at ping pong. But,
how are you in? Don't start that. how are you in? You know, Sharp is kind of like the big brother who tells you to pull his finger, isn't he? I mean, how are you in Sharp? What's your relationship like?
We are an inseparable team. I love John. I love John.
Okay.
And I won't tell you what everybody told me about him as I was coming to Texas. Some of it was even good. But we've had We have a great relationship, and the 6 chancellors met, the 5 other chancellors and I, about a month ago, for a couple hours to talk about what our legislative priorities are, what we need to do for the state of Texas. There was complete.
You're on the same page.
Agreement. Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
Nobody wants to invade the puff. That was the best news. John and I agreed with that.
Most important question I save for last, and I'm looking at Mr. Taylor when I ask it. Do you share the view of Presidents Fenves and President Young that UT and A&M need to play football again?
Yes.
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 Period, paragraph.
Absolutely.
Unambivalent.
Now, it's not going to happen next fall. These schedules are set years in advance, but the answer is yes. I think that question ought to be taken off the table. As I said the other day, I haven't met a Texan yet, although as soon as I said this, of course, several people wrote to me saying football should be banned. But anyway, I haven't met a Texan yet that doesn't think that UT and A&M should play football. And
that's it.
I stand with my friends.
Just so you know, no one out in the world cares about anything we've talked about, but they all care about that last answer. Nobody gave a crap about that stuff, but except for that. That's it.
I hope, Tim, did I get the answer right? Okay,
yes, sir, he did. Questions? We have a microphone here for the benefit of the live stream. We'll take as many as possible. Would you take this woman right here first, then we'll come around. Yes, ma'am.
So what keeps you awake at night?
Actually, I sleep pretty well. And so
Blair House is lovely.
So I don't know that things keep me awake at night, but here's what I'm driven, what keeps me awake during the day, I guess I should say. This idea that we have not yet, as a nation, done a good enough job of aligning opportunity and talent. And so it's not just Texas, but it's everywhere in the country, where we are not yet providing the access that we need and the tools that we need to help people who have talent succeed. And by that, we're shortchanging an enormous number of people here and elsewhere. And how we close that gap is what drives me every day. And if I did stay up at night, that's what I would be thinking about.
Cursed me, I said Blair House, but I meant Bauer House. I'm thinking about the thing across the street from the White House. I've already given you a new job, actually. There you go. Sir.
Hello, thank you for speaking today. My name is Sarab Sharma. I'm the chairman of Young Conservatives of Texas, and we have students at a lot of the universities under your purview. Texas A&M was just rated the gold standard for free speech rights for students in the state of Texas. How's the UT system going to catch up?
Yeah, I don't know enough about Texas A&M, except what John tells me. But I did see some report, maybe from FIRE or some other group, about maybe yellow at UT and green at A&M or something like that. I have to see about the gold standard because I'm not as sure about that color. This is enormously important to me and to my colleagues that the University of Texas system have a strong statement, a strong set of policies ensuring free expression. I personally am a fan and will probably talk to the Board of Regents about the Chicago statement, which now 55 universities across the country have adopted. The first university to adopt it was Princeton, which really sets forth in a pretty concise and coherent way what the obligations of a public institution are under the First Amendment and under the constitutional jurisprudence that interprets that. So I don't think there's an argument there. The Faculty Advisory Council of the University of Texas system has done a report on this. It was on my desk when I arrived. I'm in complete agreement. When I was at CUNY, the Faculty Senate unanimously endorsed the Chicago statement. I'll find another word for it. Maybe I'll call it the Texas statement. But I think that that's an important statement for the university system to make to the people of Texas and the world about the values that we have.
And the question here really is about protecting speech that includes and maybe especially includes unpopular speech or speech that may be from groups that are in the minority on campus.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is specifically addressed in the model policies.
Okay, sir.
Thank you both for being here. My name is Anthony Collier. I'm a legislative director on the House side, and I was actually recently accepted to UT Law. Thanks. Since the legislature relinquished tuition setting authority to the university's boards of regents. The cost at UT has increased by over 80%. So I was wondering, in your opinion, was it a mistake for the legislature to relinquish oversight over tuition?
It's a great question. Would you like to see us go back and re-regulate tuition?
Are you asking him or me?
You. I mean,
I'd be more interested in what he says. He's a guy, he's over at the Capitol every day.
Right.
So this is an interesting question. And there's a different sort of flavor of this in every state. In some states, the legislature, when they adopt their budget, will look whether you increase tuition, and they'll net that out. In some states, you have to get approval of the legislature, just like you used to have to do in Texas. And I've worked in both of those places. I think ultimately this is an important role for a governing board. It's one of the things that a governing board ought to make decisions on. They are the ones closest to the operation and charged by the people and their leaders in the state with doing that. And so I happen to think tuition is one of those things. Now, I think these decisions have to be made hand in hand with the legislature because of the relationship between appropriations and tuition.
And in fact, the reality is, although tuitions have been deregulated, and as the questioner says, it's been turfed back to the governance of these systems, the lieutenant governor has made very clear that he is not a big fan of tuition increases. So in essence, while tuition is not regulated, it's kind of regulated, right? You all can go up there with any recommendation you want in the era of deregulation, but they don't have to like it.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. And they don't actually, at the end of the day, have to approve it.
Right, correct.
But they certainly, like most things, have opinions on it, and we take them seriously.
And if your disposition is to try to work hand in glove with them in terms of the overall state appropriation for higher ed, coming in and stuffing a tuition increase up their nose that they can't ultimately do anything about is probably not a good political strategy.
You know, one of the things that I have heard coming into Texas was that not everything was done openly, transparently, in a way that policymakers felt like they had enough information about it. It's my goal to, if that in fact has been the case, to make sure it isn't the case going forward. And part of that has to be open with them about things that we're spending money on, new investments we make, tuition, anything like that.
Indeed. We have time for about one. Charlie, you go ahead. You be the bad guy here. You pick one.
Sir. Good morning, Chancellor. My name is Luke Metzger with Environment Texas. The 9,000 oil and gas wells on land owned by UT have been a source of great wealth for the system, but also a source of great pollution. Scientists tell us we have to reduce pollution dramatically and quickly to avoid the worst impacts of global warming. Do you think UT has a responsibility to reduce the pollution on these publicly owned lands?
Yes.
Unambivalent answer, yes.
Yes, no, yes. And yes, and there are a lot of issues that we face, as do other large landowners that have mineral rights that are developed as ours in the Permian Basin. There's a difference between how we manage new oil wells, old wells, and how we address the challenge, particularly of old wells. But I do think it's an important question. We have an asset that is unparalleled in public higher education in the world, and we need to protect it. And it is a fabulous benefit to us and to the economy of the state of Texas. But I do think we should be leaders, and I've had a couple of meetings already with the people who run our lands divisions about things that are underway now and things that they're looking at in the future. So I think it's a great question, and it's one that I take very seriously.
It's 9 o'clock. We're going to stop. Chancellor, can you do anything about UT losing to TCU in basketball?
I'm focused on football right now. I won the Sugar Bowl. I'm very happy about that. And now I'm suiting up for the A&M game.
It is the job of any chancellor to divert the questioner away from the sport not doing as well to the sport that is doing better. And in that respect, you have succeeded this morning, Mr. Chancellor. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you all. Good.
Thanks.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thanks.